Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait a few moments as folks join. I'm so happy to see folks this morning or this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited that everyone joined this afternoon. We have a really terrific event for you, and we'll get started in just one moment. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Corinne Carey, and I'm the Senior Campaign Director for Compassion and Choices in New York and New Jersey. I am so honored to welcome all of you and our panelists today for this discussion of various perspectives on the topic of medical aid in dying. The vast majority of Americans want end-of-life autonomy for themselves, and our movement to expand autonomy at the end of life is growing. 11 jurisdictions now authorize medical aid in dying, and Colorado is one of them. We are so fortunate to have Joanne Kelly with us today, who will share the story of her husband Alan's experience with medical aid in dying in the state of Colorado. Colorado authorized medical aid in dying via voter referendum in 2016. And one thing that we've seen over the past few years is that an increasing number of Americans now know someone, have a family member, have a friend who has been able to utilize this compassionate option in a state where it's authorized. As most of you joining this webinar know, the option is not yet authorized in New York. And while this webinar is open to everyone, this is an event hosted by Compassion and Choices in New York because we think it's really important for people to hear directly from folks who've been impacted by having this compassionate option in other states. So we've invited Joanne here to share her story. And we'll also hear from a treating physician, Dr. Benzi Kluger, who is, we're lucky enough to have him here in Rochester. He was a practitioner in Colorado, and from a spiritual leader who has been an advocate for expanding end-of-life options by authorizing medical aid in dying for many, many, many years. A good friend to our campaign, Reverend Dick Gilbert. We've set aside some time after each of these individuals speaks for questions from the audience, but you can ask them throughout this event. There is a box on the bottom or the side or somewhere on your screen that allows you to chat. If you have a question for any of our panelists or for our campaign or for Compassion and Choices, simply type that question in the box. If you're listening via Facebook, you can type your question right there in the comments section. And when we get to that part of the agenda, after we hear from our speakers, we will turn to those questions. Some of them we might ask you to speak live, or we might just read those questions aloud for the group to hear. This event is a webinar and it's being recorded. If you are a participant in the audience, you won't be on screen, and so you won't be seen in the recording, but the questions that you ask may be seen. So, you know, there's a way to ask them anonymously. There's a way to ask them just to the moderator. So just be aware of those options as you're typing in your question. I would like to introduce you to our main guest speaker today, Joanne Kelly. Joanne's husband utilized Colorado's medical aid and dying law, and her memoir about her husband Alan's death is called Walking Him Home, Helping My Husband to a Tender Death. And the publisher, She Writes Press, is going to be putting this book out in August of 2022. So we are very fortunate to have Joanne with us today, and I'm going to turn this over to her now. Joanne? Joanne, you're on mute. You are still on mute. There you go.
There we go. I am sorry to be a little clumsy here, and thank you for the introduction, Corinne. So, as Corinne said, my husband Alan died using the provisions of Colorado's medical aid and dying legislation in January of 2020. I'm going to read you a short passage from my memoir about the day Alan died, but first I'd like to share a bit about Alan and his illness and his decision to use medical aid in dying. Alan and I were married when we were in our late 40s, and it was the third marriage for each of us. The good news is the third time's the charm. It was the best thing that ever happened to both of us. Alan was kind and funny and good looking and had a million friends. He was known for his wit, and he loved to make people smile and laugh. I used to tease him that he was the only person I knew who could have an interesting conversation with a rock. He loved to cook, and he fed the birds, and he brought me coffee in bed every single morning. When Alan was in his early 60s, he started having weird, violent dreams, and he acted them out while he was sound asleep. He would let out these blood-curdling screams with no warning, or he'd start kicking and punching and groaning. He'd have no memory of these episodes in the morning. At first, it was fairly infrequent, and we weren't very concerned, but over time, it happened more and more, and the episodes grew more intense. I started waking him up during the episodes, and he would tell me that he was being chased by stampeding buffalo, or he was fighting off a gang of hoodlums in a dark alley. This sleep disorder, called REM sleep behavior disorder, was the first clue we had that something was amiss in Alan's brain. By 2015, other strange symptoms also started emerging. Alan would get really lightheaded when he stood up, to the point where he would pass out sometimes, and his bladder stopped working reliably. Alan started seeing a neurologist, a movement disorder specialist at Kaiser. Alan was a Kaiser patient. So at his first appointment with this doc, I marched into the office and I told him I was pretty sure, based on all my Google research, that my husband had multiple system atrophy. The doctor was kind, but he made it very clear that there are many neurodegenerative illnesses that look similar in the early stages, and that it would take some time to figure out which one of them Alan had. It took his doctors more than 2 years to rule out all the other possibilities and decide that Alan really did have multiple system atrophy, or MSA, which is a fatal neurodegenerative illness. And that's also about the time we met Dr. Kluger, who was doing a clinical study on palliative care for people with MSA, in which we participated. Most people who have MSA live for 3 to 5 years after diagnosis. But Alan was going downhill at just an amazing rate. He went from walking with just a little help from a cane to being full-time in a power wheelchair 16 months later. So then in early 2019, between January and May, he made multiple trips to the emergency room and was admitted to the hospital several times with blood clots in his lungs and sepsis from urinary tract infections that headed south really quickly. Alan had always said, even before we suspected he was sick, that we treat our pets better than we treat our elders, because we allow them to die. We help them die when their lives become painful and miserable. So Alan was overjoyed when the Colorado voters passed the End of Life Options Act in 2016. And I was not the least bit surprised when he started talking about using the provisions of the new law himself. In early 2019, he asked me to make an appointment for him with the Kaiser Palliative Care team so he could start the discussion about medical aid in dying. He knew he didn't qualify yet because no doctor had said that he only had 6 months to live, but he wanted to be ready when the time came. So we met with the palliative care team and they explained the other criteria. When the time came for Alan to make his official application, he would need to demonstrate that he was capable of making decisions in his own best interest. And he would need to demonstrate that he could drink the prescription medication without help. At that point, Alan felt confident he could do those things with ease, but of course we had no idea what the future held for us. Alan had already let his daughters and me and all of his medical providers know that he didn't want to suffer indefinitely. To lie around in pain, unable to take care of his own body, unable to feed himself or move or even to swallow, this sounded like hell to Alan. But the worst part for him was not being able to talk clearly enough for people to understand him, not to be able to make people smile or laugh or tell a joke or ask people about their lives. And because of his illness, he talked like someone who was falling down drunk. And when they gave him morphine to control his pain, he became even harder to understand. So Alan's plan A was to get his treating doctors at Kaiser to approve his request for medical aid in dying when he was ready. And if that failed, his plan B was to contact Dr. Kluger, because in our discussions with Dr. Kluger while we were participating in the study, we had learned that he had approved applications for medical aid in dying for some of his MSA patients. And if that failed, Alan's plan C was to refuse to be treated with antibiotics when he came down with a urinary tract infection. One time when he was being treated for sepsis at the hospital, a compassionate nurse had told him that it was a peaceful way to die. And once Alan learned that, he asked me to always ask him if he wanted to be treated when he had a UTI, not to assume, but just to always ask. It was hard, but I agreed to support him no matter what decision he made. By August of 2019, Alan's neurologist referred him to hospice, and we found an organization, a hospice organization that would come to our house and provide services for Alan at home. One of the criteria for hospice was a life expectancy of 6 months or less. So once Alan cleared that bar, he had met the first criteria for accessing Colorado's medical aid in dying law. It was a hectic time for us because I was having a hard time caring for him at home. I could no longer transfer him from his wheelchair to his bed or from his wheelchair to the toilet. So we bought every assistive device we could find, bed canes, we had a floor to ceiling transfer pole, we had a trapeze so he could pull himself up, and we bought a sit to stand device that helped for about a month. But Alan tore the rotator cuff in his shoulder using it. So we had run out of options and we were working on getting him moved into a nursing home. Alan had his meeting with the Kaiser Palliative Care team to make his official application for medical aid in dying at the end of the first week of October. We had an in-person interview and then we completed the rest of the steps in the process, which included doctor visits and a second phone meeting with the team, etc. Kaiser actually made it pretty easy for us, guiding us through the steps that we needed to take. And at the end of October, Alan got a letter saying his application was approved. He was so relieved. It gave him great peace of mind to know that he could choose to end his suffering when he was ready. On the other hand, I was stunned because some part of my brain believed that his application was going to be denied. So I vowed then and there to do everything I could to keep Alan as happy as possible so he wouldn't choose to die. I'm afraid I rode the nurses' aides at the nursing home pretty hard to give him all the TLC they could possibly squeeze into a day. He was at the nursing home for about 3 months before he decided he was ready. His words to me were, I am out of juice. So we started working on a plan, and by then it was December. I asked him to wait to die until after the holidays so his daughters and granddaughters and I wouldn't be mourning for him every Christmas for the rest of our lives. He agreed to wait until January, and we picked a date when everybody he wanted to have there for his death was available. So January 11th, 2020. Alan shared the news one-on-one with close friends, and we held a gathering at the nursing home just 3 days before he died, so neighbors and friends and people from church could come say goodbye. Alan was clear he didn't want to die at the nursing home. He wanted to be at home in his own room, surrounded by people who loved him. So I worked hard to make that happen. Our hospice organization agreed to provide an ambulance to bring Alan home on the morning of January 11th. Before I read the passage from my memoir about his final morning, I want to give you a little bit of information about the people who joined us for Alan's dying. His daughters, Alexis and Megan, were there, and his two oldest granddaughters, Caitlin, who was 15, and Olivia, who was 12. And we invited 4 other people. Beverly was, we had a downstairs apartment in our house, and Beverly lived there, and she was a retired nurse, and she helped me take care of Alan for the last year of his life, and she was like a sister to both of us, so she was there. And then there was Scott, our minister, and we also invited 2 close friends, Andy and Linda, but they were not there to participate in Alan's passing, but to take care of the rest of us. Their job was to make sure we ate and stayed hydrated, and they were there to run to the drugstore or offer hugs or whatever was needed. They were our support team. So now let me read to you, now that you know who was there, let me read to you this passage from my memoir. The house filled up with the tantalizing aroma of homemade chicken soup, a comforting backdrop for the activities about to unfold. Linda kept the soups hot all day so we could sneak into the kitchen and fill a bowl whenever we were hungry. We all trooped into Alan's bedroom and held hands around his bed. Scott led us in a prayer, and then we went around the circle, taking turns expressing thanks for Alan and blessing him on his journey. Thank you for being the best daddy a girl could ever wish for, Alexis said, as she dropped the hands she was holding to wipe her wet cheeks with a tissue. Thank you for offering me sound advice, whether I wanted it or not, Megan offered, making all of us, including Alan, smile. Offering advice was one of Alan's gifts or character flaws, depending on your point of view. I could always count on you for honest feedback to my sermons, Scott said. Sometimes it wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was always sincere and respectful. I'm grateful to you for that. Thank you for bringing me coffee in bed every day for more than 20 years, I offered. That was as close as I could come to thanking him for what I was most grateful for loving me so completely without succumbing to the tears that hovered just under the surface. I was afraid to start crying so early in the day, fearing once the spigot was open, I'd never get it turned back off. I wasn't ready to let go yet. I wanted private time to say a final goodbye to Alan, so after the Thanksgiving circle, I suggested each family member take 20 minutes alone with him. Alexis went first, then Megan. Beverly disappeared downstairs and serenaded us with the Bach suite on her cello, the rich melodies floating up the stairs, swirling around us, mingling with the soup's perfume. The rest of the assembled troops retreated to the living room. Olivia and Caitlin, glad for the break from the emotional intensity, buried their faces in their phones, while the adults made polite conversation and snacked on the cookies Linda had made. Finally, it was my turn to be alone with Alan. I closed his bedroom door and climbed in next to him in the narrow sliver of bed, nestling my head in the crook of his shoulder as I'd always done. I had held it together for longer than I thought possible that day, and I was over it. How am I going to survive without you here to love me? I wept. He held me tightly. I promise I'll be loving you from afar, he whispered. I guess that will have to do. I realized this would be the last time I would nuzzle his warm neck. I'm going to carry you in my heart for as long as I live, I promised. When my sobs subsided, I sat up and gently stroked his forehead, something I knew he found comforting. I tried to memorize his eyelids with my lips and sear the light in his eyes into the back of my retinas. I couldn't think how the day would end. I forced myself to stay in the present. When my private time with Alan was over, he asked me to bring in his granddaughters. He was pleased the two older girls had decided to bear witness to his departure. Both girls were still glued to their phones in the living room when I told them it was their turn, that their grandpa wanted a few words with them. They looked at me with terror on their faces. Caitlin shook her head. You can go in together if you want, I said, hoping to find a way to talk them into it. Caitlin looked at me as if I had two heads, a look she normally reserved for her mother. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. Please, it would mean a lot to your grandpa if you came in to talk with him for just a couple minutes, I said. Caitlin looked at her mom with a mixture of desperation and defiance on her face. As much as I wanted her to talk with Alan for his sake, I understood her reluctance. I had had my first close contact with death when I was in my 20s, when my first husband's grandfather died, and I had felt the same urge to hide from it as Caitlin did. I told her she didn't have to participate in anything she didn't want to, Megan explained to me. I turned my attention to Olivia. I knew Alan would be devastated if neither granddaughter came in to say one last goodbye. Please, Olivia, I begged, I'll go with you. Tears streamed nonstop down her face, but she didn't resist when I grabbed her hand and pulled her behind me as far as the dining room, where we stopped to grab a fresh supply of tissues. She stood next to the table and wept, looking at her shoes, crying like a child, but perched on the verge of womanhood, overcome with embarrassment and heartbreak, lips quivering. It's okay to cry, I told her. It's a really sad day, that's for sure. She nodded, and I grabbed her hand once more as we walked the last few steps down the hall and into Alan's room. I couldn't talk Caitlin into coming in, I told Alan as Olivia and I stood next to his bed. I held his hand with my right hand and Olivia's with my left. Her tears continued without a break, and she continued to study her shoes. Do you have some words of wisdom for Olivia? I asked. Alan nodded, but paused a minute as he gathered his thoughts. Then he spoke slowly, but with more clarity than I'd heard from him in a long time. Olivia, when you have important decisions to make, I want you to reach down inside and find the best Olivia that lives deep inside you. Ask her for advice. Ask her to help you make good decisions. Then listen to what she has to say. Do you think you can do that? Olivia nodded. She lifted her eyes from the floor for just an instant to look her grandpa in the eye, acknowledging his gift. I was glad to be there with her, to witness my husband at his most inspired. I marveled at his wisdom and wondered where those words had come from. Olivia and I stopped in the dining room again on our way out to exchange our wet and wadded tissues for a fresh supply. I gave her a long hug. We stood side by side and let our tears fall without restraint, without words. So the reason I chose this passage to read to you is this. On the anniversary of Alan's death, Alan's daughters and granddaughters and I met at a park that sits on top of a hill just east of Boulder. Great view of the mountains. And we scattered a few of Alan's ashes, and we laughed some and we cried some and told stories. And I asked Olivia, who was then 13, if she remembered what her grandfather had said to her that day. And she repeated his words back to me, almost word for word, the way I remember them. I believe that moment, that conversation will stay with her for the rest of her life. Alan was a good man. I miss him every day, and I'm sorry he's no longer here. But I am deeply grateful that he was able to die the tender death he envisioned for himself. Thank you.
Joanne, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. You and I have spoken about it before, but the way you describe Alan's life and his last few hours is just deeply moving, and we're so grateful that you were willing to share that story.
Thank you.
Well, we've got a fantastic next speaker as well. Dr. Benzi Kluger is a pioneer in neuropalliative care, a field dedicated to the radical idea that improving the lives of persons affected by neurological illnesses requires seeing and treating them as whole people. He says of himself in an online biography that he's constantly looking for opportunities to undermine heartless systems through subversive kindness. I love that, Dr. Kluger. Dr. Kluger created one of the first team-based neuropalliative care clinics in the world at the University of Colorado. He has published numerous papers important to the growth of this field. His research focuses on neuropalliative care, fatigue, and neurodegenerative illness. For example, Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, with some brief excursions into other areas, including nutrition, acupuncture, and cannabis. Dr. Kluger's research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, the Department of Defense, the Parkinson Foundation, and the Michael J. Fox Foundation. He is currently a professor of neurology and medicine and the founding director of the Palliative Care Research Center and Neuropalliative Care Division of the University of Rochester. As Joanne said, Joanne and Alan met Dr. Kluger when he was in Colorado, and I can't tell you how grateful I am that he's chosen as his new home, Rochester, New York. Dr. Kluger, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to turn this over to you now.
All right, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to see Joanne again. And yeah, it was interesting for me to put together my thoughts on my own journey through, with medical aid and dying. I was in Colorado when it passed, but my intersection with medical aid and dying actually began about 3 years before that, in 2012, 2011, actually, that Kirk Hall, who's a gentleman with Parkinson's, invited me to speak at one of their support groups. And specifically wanted to talk about, it came up after we began our conversation on death with dignity. And it was something that, I guess I had heard about, but I hadn't really thought about, and it wasn't something that was talked a lot about in neurologic circles. I don't think it's taught a lot about in medical school. Maybe that's changing now. But that conversation and hearing from this group of people who were living with Parkinson's, which is a relative of multiple systems atrophy, and how concerned people were of death and what death was going to look like and whether or not they would have control over their death was moving enough to me, actually, that it changed my career, honestly, and that was really, I credit as the moment when I started veering into neuropalliative care and away from traditional neurology. As I got into palliative care, one of the things that came up that surprised me, as I kind of came into it prepared to help people with their suffering and with depression and with pain, but two things that came up that I think are relevant to this conversation that surprised me. One was how isolating it is for people who are dying and know that they are dying, and that neither their physicians, nor family, nor culture is very supportive of the process of letting go. And I found that was a real gift, and could be a real gift of our clinic, and it could be a real gift for me as I'm teaching residents and medical students, to recognize and listen to that voice when people are ready to let go and to support them in that. And I know early on in my career, I was humbled because I felt that I could, address and ameliorate any form of suffering and restore, my configuration of hope, and that was not true. And I remember seeing somebody who was demoralized, who was ready to die, and despite my best efforts, they passed away within 3 months, and we got them in hospice, and I did the right things, but I felt bad that I wasn't as supportive for them as I could be, and that I didn't hear their calling as clearly as I could. And so that was something that I wanted to change. And the second thing that came up that surprised me was that a lot of palliative care is not about death. It's not even about suffering. It's about living and how people want to live their life. And I think, with Alan and his story, and with other people who I've worked with, that the choice to talk about death with dignity, and sometimes to use it, more often than not, had to do with what people valued and how they wanted to live their life. It was not so much about avoiding suffering as much as preserving themselves, preserving what was most important about themselves until the end of their life as they wanted to define it, and then not to, as I've heard other people say, die of uselessly dwindling, die of bed sores, die of other things like that. So that was kind of a lead-in. In Colorado, it was a Parkinson's patient who did a lot of the work and helped to get it on the ballot. I did vote for it. And at that time, our neuropalliative care program was up and running. And so I thought it very important to me to learn about medical aid in dying, to make sure that I was doing it right, that I spoke to Charles Blank in Oregon about his experiences. And I really saw it as a dual opportunity. And I see that, really wherever it is. I know the palliative care community is sometimes split about medical aid in dying, that the risk being, which can, come up and has come up, I think, in some European countries, that if there's medical aid in dying, that there may not be as much investment in palliative care, that people are not going to be as well supported towards the end of their life. And I understand that argument. I think it, in general, it doesn't play out. It hasn't played out to my knowledge in the US. But I wanted to make sure within our program that we actually use this as an opportunity not only to not weaken palliative care, but to strengthen it. And so at the University of Colorado, anytime somebody asked about medical aid in dying, whether or not they qualified or not, that would be grounds to see our palliative care team and to make sure that we would address whatever sources of suffering, whatever doubts, whatever lack of clarity people had for the future, and to make sure that they got support. And sometimes those conversations came up very early, that people, even around the time of diagnosis, wanted reassurance that they had a doctor who would be there for them when the time came. And that could be years, and in some cases even decades prior to, when they would likely pass away. And that was striking to me. That, I think we can tell people to not worry about things, but, we're all going to worry about what we worry about. And to, to have some reassurance and assurance that people are going to support you, when that time comes, is, I think, one of the most important aspects of the program, quite honestly. And there's statistics in Colorado and other places that, not even having the prescription, but just knowing that there's a doctor who could provide you that prescription, and cares about you and cares about your family in that way, was very important to people. And so that was something that we had in place. We also wanted to have in place a very systematic way to help support people through this process. So we wanted to make sure that people would be able to see a doctor in a timely fashion, that they could get their second appointment in a timely fashion. We wanted to make sure that everybody who had a prescription was in hospice, that they would have medical personnel around, and that they would have people around who are knowledgeable about medical aid in dying. Should they take the prescription, that they and their family would be supported. And that definitely came out of my conversations with Charles Blank and some of his experiences, that he said in the rare instances where medical aid in dying wasn't optimal were instances when people took it on their own, they went to a park or did other things, and were not being supported by a medical community when they took the medication. And I think we were successful in that. I think everybody who I know who got the prescription under my care and took it, I did talk to their families afterwards. And it was, it's hard to use the word positive in this context, but I think it was an experience that met people's expectations, that people felt was maybe positive is not the word, but right, in the sense of that it was the right decision. And it was a decision that people didn't have regrets about, that things really went well and went peacefully. After we've got things off the ground and working with people, that there were, again, things happened differently than I imagined. That, I think I was expecting that people would come with these requests because of pain that we couldn't address, physical pain. And that was, I think my image based on people with cancer, and certainly there are people with cancer who have intractable pain, where that is the primary reason for them taking it. But more often than not, and there's also research to support this, it was loss of the ability to engage in joyful activities. It was the loss of the ability to be independent, the loss of the ability to live life on one's own terms, and that the people who requested medical aid in dying were, for the most part, very strong, very independent people who knew themselves, people who were courageous, I would say, courageous enough to look death in the face and make a decision about how they wanted to live their life and to die on their own terms. And it's certainly not for everybody, and I don't think it's intended to be for everybody. That for a lot of people, depending on their illness, that they are able to die in a way that's peaceful, they're able to die in a way that's dignified to them. But sometimes that's not possible. And sometimes it's important to have that option to be able to die on one's own terms. And it's one of the ways I think that people can have victories over incurable illnesses, that they get to kind of have the last say in an illness that's robbing them of almost all other control. And then I wrote an essay on this. I was just going to read the last paragraph of it, called Medical Aid in Living, which is in JAMA Neurology. It says, I wish that death were more predictable and we could address all of the pain that arises around the end of life. I wish that there were a formula that could be applied to ensure dying is peaceful and dignified. To be clear, medical aid in dying is no such universal formula. However, in the absence of such a formula, I feel privileged to offer any help I can, humbly and without judgment, to anyone brave enough to face their mortality with eyes wide open. And thank you for your attention.
Dr. Kluger, thank you so much for that. I'm so grateful to have you here on this event and here in New York and doing the important work that you do to, I just love that, in medical aid and living, really. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the legislation that we're trying to pass here in New York. But next, I'm going to introduce you to someone really dear to us. I have known and been working with Reverend Dick Gilbert for how long now? About 6.5 years on this campaign, but Reverend Gilbert has been working on this issue long before that. Listening to his sermons, listening to the way that he speaks about this issue is so inspiring to me, and we're very lucky to have him. The Reverend Dr. Richard S. Gilbert retired in 2005 after serving for 44 years in the Unitarian Universalist ministry in Cleveland, Ohio, Golden, Colorado, Ithaca, New York, and for 32 years at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York. He received a master's in divinity from St. Lawrence University Theological School. I don't know what a doctorate in ministry from Colgate Rochester Divinity School, I think that is, and an honorary doctorates from St. Lawrence University, Meadville Lombard Theological School, and the Starr King School for the Ministry. He is the author of Building Your Own Theology, Adult Religious Education Series, as well as 3 Skinner House books, The Prophetic Imperative, Social Gospel in Theory and Practice. Another, How Much Do We Deserve? An Inquiry in Distributive Justice. And the third, In the Holy Quiet of This Hour, a book of meditations. Dr. Gilbert, Reverend Gilbert, Dr. Gilbert is an amazing writer, and I encourage you to check out his writings. But now I'm just going to turn it over to him so that we can hear him speak. Reverend Gilbert.
Thank you, Corinne. Having been a minister for 60 years, I have shared life's final exit with many people. And I've often been amazed at the dignity with which they face their death. However, too many times I have been appalled at the needless suffering as people who wish to die are kept alive through what has been called the tyranny of technology. I have seen parishioners literally starve themselves to death because they cannot facilitate the dying process. I have spoken with people who find their pain is not worth the extra meaningless days of a lingering death. I think of Lou, an elderly, lanky, Lincoln-esque man who was given a terminal diagnosis. He was a conscientious objector in World War II, unwilling to be kept alive by technology and pain. He literally starved himself to death in his own living room. There he lay on a hospital bed, weeping away. On my visits, I could see him weeping. His only comfort, the moisturizer his wife would apply to his lips. There's already a right to refuse treatment, but Diane Reed, a former national public radio talk show host, shared the story of her husband's death. He was terminally ill with Parkinson's disease and was in misery, as was Ms. Rheem, who had to watch him suffer.
Reverend Gilbert, your sound quality is a little bit hard to hear. Can you get a little tiny bit closer to the mic or speak a little bit louder? Great.
Okay. I was talking about Diane Rheem as she watched her husband die. He had Parkinson's disease and he starved himself to death, taking matters into his own hands. Diane Reem's account of those 2 weeks of unnecessary suffering has convinced her to be an advocate for medical aid in dying. In the same vein, one of my doctor friends from Rochester Strong Memorial Hospital, a palliative care expert, cites the case of one patient whose bones were literally breaking from advanced cancer. He consciously stopped eating and drinking. It took him about 10 days to die. You have to be disciplined to do it, the doctor said. Surely we can do better. Medical aid in dying legislation now before the New York State Legislature provides freedom for persons who are terminally ill to be the subjects of their dying and not the objects of medical technology or arbitrary rules. No one is coerced in this process. Ultimate decisions are left to the individual in consultation with their doctors, family, and religious counselors. As a person of faith, I have discovered that what is important in life is not the mere prolongation of biological existence. What is vital is the freedom to live a meaningful life and to die a dignified death. We're all terminal. We're all just penciled in. All of us are sentenced to die. The questions are when and how, and who will make the decision. When is a factor over which we have limited control. How is a question for which we like to have some choice. Who is important because we wish to maintain our moral agency as human beings to the end of our days. However, while everyone wants to die with dignity, we differ in our views on this issue, of course. My denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, passed a resolution supporting death with dignity in 1988. It read in part, "We are guided by our belief life has inherent dignity, which may be compromised. Life is extended beyond the will or ability of a person to sustain that dignity. We believe that it is every person's inviolable right to determine in advance the course of action to be taken in the event that there is no reasonable expectation of recovery from extreme physical or mental disability. The resolution concluded by urging constituents to petition legislators to support legislation that will create legal protection for the right to die with dignity in accordance with one's own choice. This issue, of course, has been with us for a long, long time, and there are a variety of religious views. For some faith traditions, it would be wrong to take advantage of medical aid in dying. I respect that view. For others of us, such a process is a matter of compassion and choice. The proposed legislation before the New York State Legislature recognizes this, and no one is coerced. People are free to make their own decisions, to claim their moral agency. We should have the right to die peacefully, with dignity, and on our own terms. This legislation provides that opportunity. Just recently, I've been in contact with Jeff, a ministerial colleague from Canada, whose wife exercised her right to die with dignity. He is a hospital chaplain, a strong supporter of medical aid in dying, and is writing his PhD thesis on that topic. He writes, "I certainly hope that your new governor has the sense to endorse this very humane way of dying. I've now participated in my role as spiritual care practitioner in about 6 provisions. Unfortunately, one was not professional. Kate, his wife, chose it at the end of an incredibly debilitating struggle in April. Her endurance with acute leukemia just became too much." He concludes, "My prior experiences were helpful, but when it's this close to home, all that profession has to offer doesn't make it any less wrenching." Of course, such decisions are difficult. There are no computer algorithms for calculating action. We live in the mystery of life and death. We often work in the dark. We do what we can. We give what we have. We live as we are able. If we cannot solve the riddle, and I wager we cannot, we learn to live with it and enjoy it. So we prepare for death by living a life. How one lives life says a great deal about how one faces death. For me, death is not a punishment, not a cruel fate from which we must be rescued, but part and parcel of life, a natural and necessary part of it. Judy, another one of my ministerial colleagues, and her minister husband moved to Oregon, where she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. They moved so she could take advantage of Oregon's medical aid in dying legislation, the oldest law in the country. Judy was battling a rare cancer that originated in her appendix. She had 2 goals: to live to celebrate her 77th birthday, which she did September 4th, 2020, and to vote in the 2020 election. Judy was being kept alive with the help of intravenous nutrition. Finally, she decided she could not make it to vote. She discontinued the nutrition and entered hospice care while she was still relatively strong. The morning of her death, she wrote 15 letters to registered voters in Pennsylvania, the state where she had lived before moving to Oregon a decade ago. Judy, my dear friend and colleague, lived a life to the full and died a dignified death. So moral arguments for medical aid in dying can be simply summarized. Will we control our technology or be controlled by it? We must not allow the tyranny of technology to merely prolong human suffering. The body should be the temple of the soul, not its prison. 2, who will decide how we die? We must be our own moral agents in life and death decisions. We affirm the freedom of an individual to die in dignity with medical aid in dying legislation as an option. What is the meaning of life? Sometimes the greatest reverence for life is to the quality of life, not its mere biological prolongation, that is important. For I affirm the right to die with dignity, the last right of a human being. Finally, there are other more personal reasons for supporting medical aid in dying. My parishioner, Lou, Diane Reem's husband, my ministerial colleague, Jeff, his late wife, Kate, my minister friend, Judy. Their stories persuade me like no moral argument could. All of this is why, as a minister of religion, I support medical aid in dying.
Reverend Gilbert, thank you so much for those words. Really powerful. I know that the sound quality was off for some folks, but we definitely got the spirit and the gist of what you said and the stories that you shared. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. When we began this event, I introduced myself as the campaign director for New York and New Jersey. And as such, I've had the privilege to lead efforts to pass this legislation in both states. New Jersey passed a medical aid in dying law in 2019, and it's been an incredible experience watching that state implement the law and hearing more and more of the stories of the peace that this option has brought to families and to dying people. Just to back up a little bit, I want to talk just for a moment about medical aid in dying itself, where it's authorized and where we have campaigns. Medical aid in dying is a time-tested and trusted practice that allows a terminally ill, mentally capable adult with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live to request from their doctor a prescription for medication that they can decide to self-ingest to avoid needless suffering and die peacefully in their sleep. As I was so glad to hear Dr. Kluger reference, medical aid in dying is less about dying than it is about allowing people to live the final weeks and days of their lives in a way that aligns with their personal beliefs and values. Authorizing medical aid in dying as an end-of-life care option here in New York, like our neighbors in New Jersey and Vermont have done, would empower New Yorkers, ease the pain and suffering they and their families experience, and lead to profound improvements in our healthcare delivery system. Support for legislation authorizing medical aid in dying has grown steadily over the past decade. In fact, New Yorkers support giving terminally ill adults the option of medical aid in dying by a 2-to-1 margin, according to the latest Quinnipiac polling on the issue. Today, more than 1 in 5 people in the United States now lives in a jurisdiction where medical aid in dying is authorized, including Oregon, Washington, Vermont, California, as we heard, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Montana, Hawaii, New Jersey, Maine, and just this year, New Mexico. 7 of these jurisdictions authorized the end-of-life care option within the past 6 years. And this year, 16 states, including New York, considered legislation to authorize medical aid in dying, evidence that this option is swiftly gaining support as a critical issue. Legislation that would authorize medical aid in dying here in New York was introduced in its current form in 2016. We have been building a campaign, traveling and speaking with advocates from Buffalo to Brooklyn, from the North Country to the tip of Long Island and everywhere in between, because it's a grassroots effort that is going to bring about this option. As someone asked in the chat box, can't we just put this to a voter referendum? Surely we would win if the voters were to vote on this. But we don't have that system here in New York. A system of public referenda. And that's why in some states, these measures are passed through legislation, like in New Mexico, and other states can go the referendum route. But make no mistake, we are gaining traction. We now have 53 lawmakers who have signed on and supported this bill in the Assembly, and 15 Senate co-sponsors, in no small part thanks to advocates like Reverend Gilbert and groups of people in Rochester, Ithaca, Brooklyn, Buffalo, who've gone and met with their lawmakers, who have taken to social media and asked their lawmakers why they don't support this option. There are so many questions in the chat box about why we haven't authorized this option. And one of the things that gives me hope is that, you know, change like this, major social change, takes time. It takes a groundswell of effort. It takes education. It takes batting away myths and misconceptions about what this legislation would do. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that's exactly the reason for holding this program today, is to share the experience of people who've actually lived this policy and seen how it's affected other people. So I know that Amanda, our campaign manager in New York and New Jersey, who's moderating this call from behind the scenes, has been posting links in the chat box. I want to encourage you to click on those links, sign our petition to Governor Kathy Hochul. We need her support. Jump on the webpage and learn about the New York campaign. Share your story. I know that we've gotten a number of people sharing experiences that they've had in the chat box. Share your story. There's a link there that you can do that and learn more about these efforts. I'm going to stop there. I've said enough about the New York bill, about medical aid in dying, and I think we should take some questions from the audience at this point. So I just want to thank our panelists again, and I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to tell us what kind of questions we've been getting on Facebook and here in the chat box.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. The first question that came from the audience, why, I think, Corinne, you addressed what the status of passing the law is. Can you share a little bit about what someone on this call today could do to ensure that this becomes a viable option?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing number one right now is to sign that petition to Governor Hochul. We knew we had our former governor's support here in New York. Governor Hochul just took office a few short weeks ago. She's got so many things on her agenda. She needs to see not only the poll numbers, but she needs to see energy from New York voters and a demand that this legislation pass. You know, it's not going to get to Kathy Hochul's desk, though, for her signature until it's passed by the legislature. So I would really encourage folks to sign up as a volunteer, share your personal stories. You know, we've been meeting with lawmakers. We used to do it in person in their home districts or here in Albany. At some point, we'll start doing that again. Some groups are comfortable doing that, but we meet with lawmakers a lot via Zoom. And anyone can be a part of those efforts. We are constantly requesting meetings with lawmakers who haven't yet taken a position on this bill, and they need to hear from their constituents. So if you don't know who your assembly member is, who your senator is, sign up as a volunteer, and we will share that information with you and link you up with ways for you to be active in your own jurisdiction. We've got action teams. I think we've got 10 action teams across New York State. You can join one of them and participate in their local activities, or just volunteer. If you've got 5 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour a day, several days a month, we have things for you to do. So don't be deterred by, by the word volunteer. Volunteer means a lot of different things, and we can match your skills and your interest and the time that you have to anything that you might be able to do.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Corinne. In the chat box, I did post both a petition as well as a link to send an email to your lawmakers. So if you don't know who they are, you just go click that link, you fill out the form, and it automatically sends an email to your lawmakers for you. So you don't even have to know who they are, which is good. We had a question about what type of medication is used when someone accesses medical aid in dying, and if it could be used for execution of criminals.
Dr. Kluger, do you think you could take on the question about medication?
Yeah, I can answer. Yeah, I can answer about the execution of criminals part, which is not something I have been involved in. The typical prescription these days is a combination of things: diazepam or Valium, which helps people to be calm, reduces anxiety, makes people sleepy, reduces breathing rate. Digoxin is a heart medication that causes the hearts to stop. Morphine, which is a painkiller, and then propranolol, which also affects the heart. And so there are medications in there that make people very relaxed, comfortable, sleep. And then at higher doses than we would typically use, can slow down heart rate and breathing so that people pass away peacefully and painlessly. Prior to that, some barbiturates were used, pentobarbital, but because of drug companies in this country, that drug company bought that and then increased the price of that to $2,000. And so, you know, after that, groups in Oregon and Washington came up with this kind of alternative cocktail, which works as well, equally well, and at a much lower cost.
Yeah, and I'd like to get a better answer to you about the drugs being used for execution. The drugs are completely different. So they're not the same drugs. I think I'm going to try to find something and post it in the chat box, but I didn't want that question to go completely unanswered. I mean, not only are the drugs for execution administered to someone, so it's just not, first of all, it's not the same drug, it's not the same method. And folks who've been following the death penalty debate for years know that there have been many times where the drugs used for execution have been, they aren't even imported into the US anymore. So there are better answers here. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that the drugs were entirely different. And I'll try to find an article to post in a moment. Let's see, a lot of folks are asking for the petition. We've posted it in the chat box a number of times. Amanda, do we have another question from the audience?
We do. Joanne, I think you could probably answer this question the best, but we'll see who Corinne hands it off to. There's concern around suicide and suicide prevention. How is medical aid in dying different from suicide?
You want me to answer?
I think so, Joanne, if you could address this, and then I mean, Dr. Kluger may have something to say, but I know that Reverend Gilbert could speak to this as well. But Joanne, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Okay, so I have experience with both a family member who died with medical aid in dying, that's Alan, and also with a suicide in our family, because my brother Ricky died by suicide 3 weeks after Alan and I got married. So in my mind, there are three major differences between suicide and medical aid in dying. One is the intent, because someone who dies by medical aid in dying doesn't have a choice. They want to live, but they don't have that choice because they have some illness or disease that is shortening their life. So medical aid in dying just helps them have a little bit of control at the end of their life over what their death looks like. But it's not that they want to die. But a person who chooses to die by suicide wants to die. So he or she is probably physically healthy and capable of living. They may have a temporary mental health problem, but it's a treatable, solvable problem. So that's the first difference. The second one is what the death actually looks like. If you read the stories on Compassion and Choices website about how people choose to end their lives when they use medical aid in dying, you'll find that people surround themselves with their loved ones, and they design endings that are warm and loving and full of gratitude and forgiveness. These passings are peaceful. Suicides, on the other hand, are executed in secrecy. The person dies alone without their loved ones present. Frequently, suicides are violent as well, because approximately half of all suicides are committed with guns, which means they also leave behind a huge mess. Which brings me to my last point, which is the emotional impact on loved ones are like night and day. When Alan died, it was very, very sad, but we had time to prepare ourselves, and we were able to say to Alan what needed to be said to him. I love you, and I forgive you, and I ask for your forgiveness, and I thank you for being in my life. So we had a loving goodbye. But when my brother Ricky died, it was more like being hit by a truck. It came out of left field, and it left us all crippled, his whole family. My parents were never the same after his death. And all of us spent years racked with guilt that we hadn't seen that he needed our help. We spent years wondering what we could have said differently or done differently that would have prevented the tragedy. His daughter, who was 10 when Ricky died, has deep emotional scars that still plague her today. So Alan's death was tender and loving, and Ricky's death was profoundly traumatic. And when you compare Olivia's experience with her grandfather's death via medical aid in dying and my niece's experience with the death of her father, they couldn't be more different.
Thank you for sharing that, Joanne. Do either of our other panelists want to address this question of the difference between medical aid in dying and suicide?
I guess I would just add and echo from Joanne. I mean, I think that terminology and moving away from physician-assisted suicide to medical aid in dying is important, because it does emphasize this is something that's available to people who have a terminal illness, and that it's an aid in the dying process rather than a voluntary suicide. The second thing that I have been involved in is on the emotional side. That I think this is true in all 11 jurisdictions, is that you have to assess capacity, so people's ability to make a decision, but you also have to assess for depression. And although people can have some depression, and you have to be careful about that term, because people can have grief, they can have sadness, and that there's a lot of difficult emotions that are normal when somebody has a terminal illness. But part of my job in dispensing the medications is to make sure that it's not being primarily driven by depression, and that it's not being primarily driven, by emotional distress. And talking about suicide is, it's its own giant topic, but I think that's an important safeguard. And how we support people who are suicidal is going to be very different than how we support people who are nearing the end of their lives from a terminal illness.
Reverend Gilbert, would you like to say a few words about this?
Much more to say. That's great.
Oh, could you speak up? We're having a hard time hearing you. Yeah.
What has been said is pretty much all that can be said, except that my experience with suicides in my congregations, despair, hopelessness, often hate and anger. Yet medical aid in dying is encased in love all the time.
Thank you for that. Amanda, do we have another question from the audience?
Yeah, actually, this question was asked a few different times in a few different ways. So I think it's really important to address. How do we create safeguards to ensure that people at the end of life are not tragically cut short by greedy relatives and caregivers that only see the extension of their life as a drain on money that will be left to them? There's concerns around dying people being guilted into taking their own life prematurely. So how do we safeguard against that, stop that from happening?
Joanne, yeah, why don't you take it first?
So when Alan had his interview with the Kaiser Palliative Care team to see if he qualified, they kicked me out of the room. They wanted to talk to just Alan by himself, and they asked him specific questions regarding, was anybody pressuring him, whose idea was this, et cetera, et cetera. So Alan made it really clear, this is what I want, absolutely not what Joanne wants. And I think that is, in our case at least, I thought it was a good safeguard. And I can't imagine that not being a good safeguard. If somebody felt like they were being pressured, that would be the time for them to speak up and say, you know, this is a relative's idea, et cetera.
Mhm. Dr. Kluger, did you want to address this question as well?
Yeah, sure. And Colorado, I think, is pretty similar to other states and kind of similar to Joanne's experience, that there are a number of safeguards built into it. You know, one is that the person living with a serious illness has to affirm that this is what they want without any loved ones in the room. They have to make a written request. They have to make 2 requests. In Colorado, is 15 days apart. We have to make sure that the person with serious illness has capacity, meaning that they understand their condition, that they don't have dementia or other things that would, you know, make them easier to manipulate, but also allow them to fall into a decision that they don't really understand or don't want. There is the safeguard around depression. And I think if you look at the data of who is getting prescriptions and who's using it, that you know, that there hasn't been, to my knowledge, and someone may correct me, any evidence that, at least as it's been done in the United States, any evidence of even small spread abuse, much less widespread abuse, that it seems to, you know, really be done. You know, if anything, it may be harder to get than it needs to, but I think, you know, we'd probably mostly rather err on the side of, you know, making sure that, you know, people are not coerced into it. Rather than making it too easy. That you know, and I definitely felt, you know, in my work with it and my work with other physicians, that you know, that the safeguards made sense, and that people who were involved from the medical side and the patient side were following them and were respectful of the intent behind the law.
Yeah, so I'll just add that New York's law is modeled after the laws that came before, and we've got more than a dozen safeguards attached to the law. From start to finish, the process is initiated and carried out by the dying person alone. I think some people worry about health proxies or conservators or people that are making decisions for others. And the only person that can request medical aid in dying is the dying person. As Dr. Kluger said, they have to make that request in writing and orally, witnessed by 2 people. 2 doctors have to confirm both the diagnosis of a terminal illness. That terminal illness has to be incurable and irreversible. The person has to be within 6 months of death, a reasonable expectation that the person will die within 6 months. And then they have to be able to ingest the medication on their own. So really, the process is tightly controlled from start to finish. And if anything, as Dr. Kluger said, it's difficult. Working on implementation issues in New Jersey, it's difficult to find physicians who are comfortable providing this compassionate care at the end of life. And it's quite burdensome to make your way through the process. What we've seen in studies from California and elsewhere is that many people pass away before getting through all of the steps of requesting and receiving this medication. The other thing I might mention is that, you know, when someone is receiving hospice care, which is covered by, you know, almost every insurance and public benefits, once someone is in hospice care, in almost every state, I would imagine, Dr. Kluger can correct me if I'm wrong, they have to forego curative treatment. And so the person isn't using a tremendous amount of healthcare resources at that point because they've qualified for hospice and they're not pursuing curative treatments any longer. That isn't to say that there aren't still expenses associated with care, as Joanne mentioned, the accoutrement, the different kinds of healthcare aids that they had in the home were expensive. I think what I've seen across the country in states that have authorized medical aid in dying is that families are, if anything, reluctant to let go. It's one of the many complicated reasons why people don't enter hospice. When my own father was dying 7 years ago, or 8 years ago now, we didn't want to say that this was the end. The doctors didn't want to recommend hospice. No one wanted to say that he had reached the end of the road with treatment. If anything, families want their loved ones to stay longer. And really, most people who access medical aid in dying, and it's a very small number, it's around 0.5% of the deaths in authorized jurisdictions come about with medical aid in dying. These folks are really close to death. I mean, witnessed by the fact that so few people make it through the entire process, that it isn't a matter of prematurely dying. If anything, it's happening just in time for some people. Anyway, I'm rambling. It looks like Reverend Gilbert wants to say something.
I would just suggest for anyone who has questions of this sort that they read the legislation, the law, which you can access easily online. It's full of legalese, but when you see all the precautions and all the codicils and so forth, you know that's a very difficult process. Or better yet, you can read the Compassionate Choices summary of the bill, which is more readable. But to read the law is a good experience for you, I think.
Maybe Amanda, if you've got a chance to post the link to the legislation, I think it's on the page that you posted earlier, but let's see. Amanda, do we have another question from the audience?
We do. The difference between palliative care at home and medical aid in dying that is being discussed is the difference that the ailing person can self-administer as opposed to someone from a health agency having to administer. I think what's important for this question is breaking down the difference between palliative care, hospice care, and what medical aid in dying would allow.
Dr. Kluger, I feel like this is a question for you.
Yeah, sure. So we can kind of talk about and even expand the question about how people can have control over the dying process. On the one hand, there is people can refuse certain treatments. So when we're filling out advanced care planning forms, people can say, do not resuscitate. And so it allows for a natural death. People cannot be forced to have feeding tubes placed, to have airways placed. And that gives people some level of control. People can also, actually, as Joanne discussed, refuse other potential treatments such as antibiotics. And it's not uncommon that people with neurologic illnesses like Alzheimer's or MSA or things like that may reach a point in their illness journey where further treatment of infections is bringing them at best back to a state of affairs that is less than they would consider to be ideal for moving on with their lives. And so it can be compassionate to not treat an infection and allow nature to take its course. And as Joanne mentioned, that's often a peaceful way for people to pass away. Hospice allows people and their families to get an extra layer of support. And the goal of hospice is not to hasten death, but really to support people in living until they die. And in fact, sometimes people live longer on hospice. My record holder was on hospice for 6 years. And I think hospice allowed them to live for 6 years because it allowed this woman's very tough German mother to care for her. And it kept her from going in and out of the hospital, where I think she most likely would have passed away within probably a few weeks of when we actually started hospice. Medical aid in dying is, I think, conceptually related to hospice in that it's for terminally ill people, and it provides them with support and control over how they die. And one step further, if we were wanting to discuss it, would be euthanasia, which is having medical personnel administer medications. And that is not what's legal in the United States for any of the medical aid in dying. It all has to be self-ingested, but there are countries where euthanasia is available, and medical personnel can deliver medication, again, to people with terminal illnesses to help them to end their lives earlier than they might otherwise naturally, but still in the context of having a terminal diagnosis.
Thank you so much for that answer. Amanda, any other questions?
Sure. I'll have this one be the last one, but how long must you live in a state to use medical aid in dying?
Yeah, every state is a little bit different. There are some states that have residency requirements. And I would say as a general matter, in states that have residency requirements, it's not how long you've lived in the state. It's about whether the doctor is satisfied that you've established residency. And, you know, I say all of that, but it's actually quite hard to move to another state. I think Reverend Gilbert talked about it in his remarks. We've certainly seen some examples of this. Brittany Menard was the most famous of those cases, a 29-year-old woman who moved from California to Oregon to access the option. But having worked with many dying people here in New York, I know that it's not so much the length of time that you need to be in a state, it's all of the other hurdles. You know, we are working with a dying woman here in New York who has tried to pack up and move to a state where she's got the resources to do that. And that, you know, that's another hurdle. And she just doesn't have the energy at this point with the treatments that she's undergoing and the fatigue. Once you move, you then have to establish a care team. You need a doctor, a treating physician, a second consulting physician. It's not an easy process at all. And so there are residency requirements in various states. They differ, but that's not really the barrier. The barrier is that the time you have a terminal illness and you qualify for medical aid in dying, you know, the ability to actually make that move becomes very difficult. I think we might have time for one more.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was
sorry,
just going to say, just to piggyback on that question, can people specify medical aid in dying in their living will? Like what if they have dementia and they are no longer competent, but specified this desire when they were still competent?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it's one of those things where it's not a satisfying answer for people who are, you know, looking at what kind of care that they want, should they receive a dementia diagnosis. But it's an important safeguard, right? Remember what I said earlier, the process is directed by the patient from start to finish. They need to make a contemporaneous decision to self-ingest the medication. So no, you cannot put in your living will that you would like someone to administer medical aid in dying at the end. It's just simply not. That's not the way medical aid in dying works. Medical aid in dying is a self-directed option. There are things that people who are concerned about a diagnosis of dementia can do. And we've got a whole area on our website, if we can pull it up and paste it here, about putting in writing the kind of care that you'd like to receive. And I'm thinking about something, Joanne, you said earlier about what Alan said about being treated for a urinary tract infection. That you can make the decision to forego any curative treatment should you be unable to make your own medical decisions. And that, you know, I gave a talk at a group a few years ago, and I was discussing this very question, and a woman in the audience stood up and she said, you know, my mother had early onset dementia, and she had written in her living will that she didn't want to be treated with antibiotics. And so when she did develop an infection in the hospital, the doctor called me in and said, you know, do you know that this is your mission and what will happen? And she said it felt like she had been given a gift by her mother. She knew that her mother didn't want to linger with dementia, and she knew that not being treated for the infection would lead to a fairly swift death of her mother, which in fact it did. And so her daughter didn't have to make that decision for her. She made it in her living will. You cannot make the decision about administering medical aid and dying medication. So hopefully that answers that question.
I would suggest that people in New York State take advantage of the MOLST. That is the one legal document in New York State, medical orders for sustained life treatment or something of that sort. The MOLST document, which gives you a chance even to talk about these things. We've been doing that with our two sons. So they know where our documents are, they know our wishes. We fill them out in writing with them as witnesses. And that's all part of this whole spectrum leading up to possible medical aid and dying. They know we support that option.
Yeah,
So
Reverend
talk it over with your children.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's not only important to investigate all of the different kinds of advanced directives, including the MOLST that you can put in place here in New York, and those resources Amanda just posted in the chat box, but talking to your loved ones, making sure that you identify a healthcare proxy that's willing to carry out your wishes, and not their own at the end of life. And so it may be one son and not the other. It may not be one of your children. It's important to have those conversations and to pick the right person who's comfortable carrying out your wishes. Joanne or Dr. Kluger, do you have anything you want to add or any final words before we close up here? Okay. Well, hopefully we've been able to answer a lot of the questions that you have. I know that we got them from Facebook, from the chat box, from the Q&A. And I know that folks, one of the things that is clear from the questions is the frustration. Why don't we have this option everywhere? And believe me, as the director of this campaign, I sometimes share that frustration, but this is a process. And I know that in New Jersey, it took us 7 long years of a campaign to pass this measure. New York lawmakers are even more skeptical than New Jersey. And it really takes, lawmaker to lawmaker efforts to change their minds. We need you to get involved. So thank you for being part of this program. That's part of what we're trying to do here, is to normalize the conversation, to show what having this option does for families. And so in that regard, I want to thank Joanne. Joanne, thank you so much for writing your memoir, for sharing your thoughts with us, for reading from a passage from that memoir and answering these questions. Your experience is so valuable here. Dr. Kluger, thank you so much for the work that yes, thanks. Dr. Kluger, thank you so much for the work that you do to advance palliative medicine, to care for people, and for really sharing your own experience with Alan with us today, and to Reverend Gilbert for all of your advocacy over the years. I want to thank Amanda for doing everything on the back end to make this event possible. And I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in today for this important discussion. I hope that you've learned something here. I hope that you have hope, because I believe that it's not whether New York will pass a medical aid and dying law, it's when. It will happen. The question is when. So you can help with that. Click on these links, sign the petition, send a letter to your lawmaker, and volunteer with us. Thank you. And there'll be a recording of this presentation on our website soon. And have a very good night.